They were so pious and sanctimonious about the Tories when they were in opposition, and they had plenty to have a go at on the Tories. No question about that. But it's now come back to bite them. The Sue Gray thing, I think, is a bit more worrying because it suggests that Keir Starmer doesn't have control of Downing Street in the way he should. And of course, that brought Boris Johnson down. He didn't have control of Downing Street. It was chaotic. And when a prime minister has to say, look, I'm in control, when he has to say that less than 3 months in power, you know it's a real mess. You know it's in real trouble. When he had normally prime ministers say, I'm in control in their dying days. That's not in their first 3 months.
Andrew Neil just turned Keir Starmer into political soup. Lukewarm, flavourless and confusingly grey. If you thought Starmer could dodge questions like Neo in The Matrix, wait till you see him fumble like he's lost Wi-Fi mid-sentence. Stay tuned, because Andrew Neil didn't just grill Starmer, he flambéed him, served him with chips, and still asked for a refund.
But no, that's not process, that's
well,
the
you're
rules.
following the process, but there's a bigger principle at stake, that Labour Party members who are being asked to vote for you should know who's bankrolling your campaign.
That is why the Labour Party set up those rules.
But you won't tell us.
The Labour Party rules say, carry out the checks, which we have to carry out, and I've got a compliance team doing that. Once you're satisfied the checks are carried out and the donations are proper in order, they go to the parliamentary authorities who put them on the parliamentary website so that everybody can see them. I've been following that procedure. That is exactly the parliamentary rules.
But the other candidates in this contest have published who is bankrolling their campaign. You seem to be hiding behind this process. Why won't you simply tell us tonight who are your 5 biggest donors?
Andrew, how can you say I'm hiding behind a process when it's the Labour Party process? The Labour Party, beginning of...
Because you're hiding behind the process.
No,
You know that feeling when you're stuck watching someone try to explain something, but it's like they're speaking another language? Yeah, that's Keir Starmer in a nutshell. The guy's political charisma is about as effective as a damp tea bag in lukewarm water. And just when you thought Starmer was the human embodiment of blandness, here comes Andrew Neil, the political interrogator with a face so serious it could stop a speeding train, to slice through Starmer's rehearsed nonsense like a hot knife through stale butter. This isn't your average takedown. No, no. This was a public roast. A total political humiliation that left Starmer looking like the guy who accidentally showed up to a knife fight with a spoon.
Why don't you do what the other candidates do and tell... Don't Labour members have a right, as they decide whether to vote for you or not, they want to know where your money's coming from?
I've been asked that many times. I've said it's coming from trade unions, from crowdfunding, from individual donations.
Who's your biggest donor?
It's coming from those 3. One of my biggest donors was put up on the website, I think, yesterday.
Right, that's one of the lawyer.
Yeah.
That's the law. But who are your 5 biggest donors?
Well,
you haven't announced. You've only announced about £125,000 worth of donations. This campaign costs a lot more than that. Doesn't transparency just demand? I mean, it's causing you a problem.
First off, let's talk about Starmer's vibe. The man carries all the warmth and spontaneity of a malfunctioning chatbot. His political style screams, "I'm here to follow the script, don't expect surprises." Watching him talk politics is like sitting through an endless legal deposition session where no one gets excited and everyone's just praying for it to end. Enter Andrew Neil. The guy's like a human scalpel, precise, sharp, and ready to dissect Starmer's every word with clinical efficiency. Neil isn't here to make friends. He's here to ask the questions Starmer desperately wants to dodge. Watching Neil poke holes in Starmer's armour is like watching a lion toy with a particularly limp gazelle. It's brutal, relentless, and oddly satisfying.
I mean, there are a lot of fundamental issues which need to be tackled in our country. A lot of them are allowed just to atrophy under the Conservatives. They ran out of any reforming zeal. But given the scale of problems that we face, from health to infrastructure and so on, he just doesn't have the blueprint that is going to put that right. I think he can do some things that will improve matters, but this will not be a transformative government. He doesn't have it in him to be transformative. The cabinet isn't good enough to be transformative either. So I think it's the best you can hope for
is that things get a bit better. And, even that would be something.
What made it even funnier? Starmer's serious lawyer act started to crack almost immediately. He tried the usual stony-faced stare, that I'm thinking deeply look. But let's be honest, he looked more like someone who just realised he forgot his lines in the middle of a school play. No charm, no spark, just robotic mumbling and vague hand gestures that screamed, "Help me."
Pretty much consign everything Labour had to say about tax during the election campaign to the dustbin of history. Consider how the narrative has changed. Before the election, we were assured that all Labour spending plans were fully costed and that there was no need for taxes to rise, bar a few small and specific increases like VAT on school fees. Within weeks of being elected, Chancellor Rachel Reeves claimed to have discovered a £22 billion fiscal black hole left behind by the dastardly Tories. PR and the IFS had already warned that Labour would inherit an eye-wateringly tight fiscal position, but that didn't stop Reeves affecting to be surprised. Nobody else was.
Now, the real fun began when Starmer's economic plan started sounding less like policy and more like the political equivalent of "just trust me, bro." With the confidence of a man who's never had to explain the bill at dinner, he tossed around lofty phrases like investment in growth and fair redistribution, as if those words alone would magically balance the budget and solve inequality overnight. But when pressed for details, Starmer gave the kind of vague non-answers you'd expect from someone who studied economics at Hogwarts. It was like listening to someone describe a utopia where money rains from the sky and prosperity is just a heartfelt speech away. Except Starmer forgot to mention where the clouds were coming from, or who was footing the umbrella bill. Every promise sounded great in theory, right up until you asked how it would work. Then suddenly, it all dissolved into a cloud of buzzwords, wishful thinking, and the subtle art of hoping no one asks follow-up questions. His economic blueprint had all the realism of a fairy tale, minus the talking animals and happy ending. If leadership means pretending to have a plan, then Starmer's practically Prime Minister of Narnia.
And we'll look
I
at
don't
the
think sort of
unity too.
thrashing around and blaming X, Y, and Z.
But if you have nothing bad to say about, and I would suggest to you, you cannot plan the future without understanding the past. And if you have nothing bad to say about Mr. Corbyn's leadership now, why did you take part in the attempt to topple him as leader in 2016?
Well, in the immediate aftermath of the referendum, I thought we needed a change, and I set out my reasons for it. We then had a leadership election. Jeremy won it convincingly. I accepted the members had put him in as leader, and I then served him for the next 3.5 years.
You said it was simply untenable to suggest that we can offer an effective opposition without a change of leader. Untenable.
But we then went through a process.
Neil's fact checks landed like sledgehammers, not the gentle rubber mallet kind either, but the full industrial strength variety that smash right through facades and leave rubble where half-truths used to stand. Every time Keir Starmer tried to insist that Labour had a clear and credible plan, Neil pulled out receipts like a man auditing a dodgy tax return. Charts, numbers, previous quotes, contradictions. It was less of an interview and more of a forensic takedown. Starmer would say something vaguely optimistic, and Neil would respond by essentially holding up a giant neon sign that read, "Wrong." Each fact check chipped away at the illusion of competence. Starmer's responses didn't just lack detail, they lacked direction. It was like watching someone try to assemble IKEA furniture without the manual, or tools, or even the right parts. Instead of specifics, he offered jargon-laced generalities, the political equivalent of filling in a test with C for every answer and hoping for the best.
Can you give me one tough message from you in this campaign that the Corbyn left would find unpalatable?
Well, that we have to unite the party, and that means taking people wherever they are.
Everybody wants to unite the party.
Well, everybody wants to unite the party, but you've got to model unity. What I'm doing in my campaign is I've got people from different parts of the party on my campaign working together, because I know that simply saying unity isn't enough. Everybody's going to say
that's not
I've got to
unpalatable. What I'm
model
asking you is a position you're taking that the Corbyn left will find unpalatable.
Well, I'm not particularly interested in finding things that they find palatable or unpalatable.
The more Neil pushed, the more Starmer folded into his trademark fog of ambiguity. It was like watching a man try to juggle smoke. Impressive in a way, but ultimately useless. With each probing question, Starmer seemed less like a prospective Prime Minister and more like a malfunctioning I trained solely on corporate mission statements. It was as if he were auditioning for the lead role in The Political Fog Machine, live at the West End. A tragicomedy featuring one man, infinite buzzwords and absolutely no answers. Platitudes poured out of him so thick and shapeless, they could have been pumped into the atmosphere and classified as a new climate hazard. He spoke of moving forward and building consensus with all the energy of a GPS stuck in a roundabout. Every sentence felt meticulously engineered to sound meaningful while saying nothing. The political equivalent of decaffeinated coffee, familiar, palatable, and entirely ineffective. One moment, he was boldly refusing to rule things out. The next, he was cautiously declining to rule them in. At one point, he seemed to hover in a quantum state of policy where he both supported and opposed something simultaneously. A Schrödinger's politician, if you will. The only consistent takeaway was that Starmer clearly wanted to give the impression of having a plan, without committing to anything that might one day come back to haunt him. Which, unfortunately for him, was precisely Neil's specialty, cutting through the fog with the precision of a political scalpel. And as Starmer squirmed and sidestepped, it became painfully clear. When pressed for clarity, he retreats into mist.
Reeves says the budget was a one-off, that others won't be like this one. But if the OBR's anemic growth forecasts are still too optimistic, she will be back for more tax and more borrowing. But it was a watershed budget. It propels the UK tax burden and public spending as a share of GDP towards European social democratic levels. That was no accident. It was the chosen direction of travel of the Starmer-Reeves project. Just why, unless driven by ideology, they want to join a collection of economies synonymous with slow growth and stagnation is a puzzle. But that is where they've chosen to head. And the OBR, in terms of what it means for economic growth and living standards for the rest of this decade, has already spelled out the consequences.
Here's where the roast really hits home. Starmer's so-called vision for the country. You'd expect the leader of the opposition, someone whose entire job is to offer a clear alternative, to have a crystal clear, inspiring plan for Britain's future, right? Well, brace yourself, because what Starmer delivered was about as clear as mud. His vision was so foggy, it made a typical London morning look like a sunny day in the Bahamas. When Neil asked Starmer to paint a picture of what a Labour-led Britain would actually look like, all he got was a political PowerPoint with key slides missing and bullet points that didn't add up. It was like someone hit skip intro on an entire strategy session. Starmer's answers were a parade of vague statements, uninspired buzzwords, and cliches so overused they probably have their own pensions by now. You know those phrases that politicians love to recycle: building back better, uniting the country, investing in the future. Yeah, all that, but served lukewarm and half-baked. It felt less like a visionary speech and more like a political safe zone where no risk was taken and no original thought was allowed to peek through. Honestly, it was like Starmer was trying to describe a movie he never actually saw, or summarising a book he skimmed in 5 minutes. There was no substance, no passion, just an endless loop of carefully rehearsed corporate speak statements that sounded like they were whipped up by some PR firm overnight. No spark, no excitement, just the blandest, most forgettable political spiel you've ever heard. And if that's the opposition's idea of leadership, Well, Britain might as well start enjoying the fog.
Been seeing some reports over the weekend that the government was briefing that this could add 2% to our GDP. Well, in their dreams, it's never going to do that. It's marginal at best. And the argument is not this deal on its own. Is it, where does it lead? Is that the end of it? Is this the end of the reset? Or is this the start of the reset? If it's the end of the reset, then it's marginal. There are some improvements in some areas where the government's made concessions that it shouldn't have done. But in the grand scheme of things, it's quite small.
And while Starmer babbled in circles, desperately trying to make sense, but only managing to sound like a confused parrot on repeat, Neil's expression was absolutely priceless. A perfect cocktail of disbelief, pity, and that classic, please stop embarrassing yourself look you give when someone keeps digging their own grave with every word. Watching Starmer struggle was like watching someone try to explain TikTok to their grandparents. Painfully awkward, excruciatingly slow, and frankly, kind of tragic. You could practically see the collective eye rolls from the audience, wondering if this man actually knew what he was talking about, or if he was just reading from a script written by someone equally lost. And just when you thought Neil's roast couldn't get any more savage, he zeroed in on Labour's ongoing soap opera of internal chaos. Because if politics is a stage, Labour's party meetings are like a toddler's birthday party gone horribly wrong. Screaming, tears, tantrums, and one meltdown after another. It's a circus act no one signed up to watch, but can't look away from either. Neil didn't hold back as he grilled Starmer about every scandal, every public spat, and all the factional fights tearing Labour apart from the inside out. Starmer's attempts to act like the grown-up in the room were about as convincing as a cat trying to herd a bunch of wild mice. Utterly hopeless, and more than a little laughable.
I think and that's a tough one to answer, I think for Mr. Starmer it is, well, you say that, but you've said the following things over the past 5 years, none of which you now stand for. I interviewed him for the Labour leadership on the BBC. I think it was towards the end of February 2020, just before the pandemic started to hit. And he went through a whole range of things, nationalised rail, mail, energy, and so on, abolish universal credit, abolish university tuition fees, wealth tax, and all the rest of it. And I said, but how can we? He said, Andrew, these are not promises, these are pledges. Now, I didn't, just being a simple lad, didn't understand the difference between promise and pledge. I thought they're the same thing, but it doesn't matter what it means because he's broken them all. So I think that's a problem for him.
The mental image here? Starmer desperately trying to be the responsible adult. But Labour's chaos was more like a reality TV show where he's just the guy holding the camera, hoping no one notices the mess behind him. Of course, the internet had a field day. Social media exploded with memes roasting Starmer like a Sunday BBQ gone horribly wrong. One meme showed Starmer as a Wi-Fi signal struggling to connect. No bars, no hope. Another compared him to a buffering YouTube video. Please wait while we pretend to have answers. The hashtag Starmer buffering trended faster than you can say political crisis. People joked about Starmer needing a tutorial on how to answer questions, or at least a script with better punchlines. Some even said Neil's interview was basically a masterclass in how to turn a politician into an accidental comedian. And let's be honest, the memes were deserved. Starmer's robotic performance, combined with Neil's merciless grilling, was the perfect storm for viral roasting content. Twitter feeds filled up with jokes about Starmer's seriousness, being just an elaborate act to hide how lost he really is.
Well, you're right that we still don't know the details, though the one detail we've got, I think, is a problem for the government, which is it's basically rolling over the existing EU access to British fisheries waters for another 12 years. And I saw earlier you were a bit surprised by that because it's way above the upper end of what Britain was expected to concede. Some talked of 5, they maybe got up to 10, nobody was talking about 12. So I think the European Union will regard that as a major victory. That's a notch on their lap.
Andrew Neil didn't just fire Keir Starmer. He turned him into a walking cautionary tale. Starmer's political career after this looked like a laptop stuck in loading mode, spinning wheel and no progress. Neil showed the world that Starmer's polished image is just smoke and mirrors. Behind that serious face is a politician who can't articulate policy, dodge tough questions only so long, and whose leadership feels like a perpetual buffering icon. If Starmer wants to bounce back, he'll need more than rehearsed sound bites and legalese. He'll have to show some actual substance, some passion, and maybe, just maybe, learn how to handle a grilling without looking like a deer caught in headlights. But until then, we'll just keep replaying this interview, watching Neil dismantle Starmer like it's the political version of Game of Thrones, except with fewer dragons and more awkward pauses.